Alright guys, so as I said in the introduction video, the focus really of this lecture was meant to be Deleuze, but I thought it would be also good to do a recap of everything we've done up to now, and also to talk about some of the movies that are going to come up for analysis in your second assignment or your second essay. Okay, so there's going to be three parts to this lecture. There's going to be a discussion of the various films, the contemporary films that borrow from Italian neorealism. There's going to be a recap of everything we've done. There's going to be a discussion of Deleuze and what he saw in Italian neorealism and his insights into it. And we'll talk a little bit also about Rachel Gabara, which is the topic for lecture number 10. Alright guys, so remember throughout the lecture series for this module, we look at three different themes or three different historical film movements, and the one that we've done thus far was the Soviets. And you will remember that the Soviets, what they were trying to do was try to shock us. But how did they try to shock us? They tried to shock us through technical form. And what we mean by technical form is really the composition of the film. So we're talking about editing and so forth. They tried to shock us into action through their editing. But this is the first key point, and I've mentioned it in some lectures before. What the Italian neorealists offer is a serious reflection through thematic development. So it's what's inside the shot. And when you think of Italian neorealism, you should really see it as a philosophical orientation, right? A philosophical orientation that's reflected in the stories told and also how they are told. So it's not really the editing or the technical form that's important here, but it's the philosophical orientation or the philosophical consideration on the part of the filmmakers involved. So we're looking really at what's inside the shot, not how that shot is composed, like we were interested in for the Soviets. And the most important thing, and I've mentioned it in a few lectures previous, is that in these films, in these Italian neorealist films, whether it's the original Italian films or whether it's contemporary films that have been inspired by this particular film movement, the most important kind of idea, and it's completely opposed to the standard Hollywood idea, the main idea is that the individual or the protagonist in these Italian neorealist films is someone that is held hostage by a constellation of social forces. Right, so they don't have agency, they don't have total control over their circumstances. Very often, no matter how hard they try, they are defeated by their circumstances. And that should be especially relevant to all of us now, right? As we suffer the effects of this pandemic, we all feel a lack of agency and a lack of control. Some of the big ideas present within the films, we've spoken about this already, but the one we focus on today is this idea of drifting, or drift in Italian neorealism. The characters in these films, or the protagonist specifically, doesn't move from point A to B like you would see in an American film. They don't move from A to B in a determined fashion. There's often a lot of drift. They don't move in a linear narrative. They kind of just exist while this constellation of forces plays out around them. There's going to be a lot of blurring of things in this film movement, and the most important type of blurring is this blurring between reality and fiction. So I've mentioned before that often when you watch an Italian neorealist film, you're not exactly sure, am I watching a documentary, am I watching a fiction? And that is done for purpose. They're trying to kind of mess with your sensibilities a little bit. But it's not shocking like the Soviets. It's a sensual, evocative type of cinema, right? but they are trying to get at your sensibilities. And ambiguity is the other one, right? These films are ambiguous or ambivalent. There's no kind of clean and neat plot resolutions and so forth. So remember, just like in the first essay, the second essay, shouldn't worry about it yet because we're only speaking about it in detail and doing an assignment workshop in lecture 2, lecture 11, and this is lecture 9. But it's a good time to start thinking about the various contemporary films that you'll be analyzing for that essay number 2. Because remember, we always do the same thing. We look at the film movement itself. That's always the first half of your essay. You always explain what that film movement was all about. And then you apply the techniques to the contemporary film. So I've chosen a number of contemporary films for you. And you have to pick one for analysis, right? One for analysis. And you can, by the way, ignore that part that says which will take place in May. Obviously, dates change, and I'll let you know more about that. But here's the 5 films. There's a 6th one as well that I'll mention to you. It's Up in the Air by Jason Reitman, Bernie by Richard Linklater, Motorcycle Diaries by Walter Salles, Where Do We Go Now by Nadine Labaki, and the one I've got in red, and I've got it in red specifically because in normal times this is the one I always show in class, and this is the one I recommend for students to do. It's the easiest one. The techniques borrowed from Italian neorealism are very, very obvious in this one. Right, Rabbit Proof Fence, 2002, by the director Philip Noyce. Okay, a bit more detail, but before we get into the detail, the 6th film I forgot to mention was a wonderful film called Look Who's Back, right? A wonderful film coming out of Germany, and it starts off as a comedy, and it descends into something quite dramatic and quite horrific, right? And the basic premise of that film is that it's 2011 or 2012, I can't remember, Berlin, Germany, and Adolf Hitler wakes up. It turns out that he didn't actually commit suicide or die, and he returns, right? And he starts walking the streets of Berlin, and he becomes a bit of an internet sensation and a YouTube sensation up front, but terrifyingly, and this is a spoiler alert, but terrifyingly, he then comes to power. So there's another choice for you. It's a bit of a tricky film to do. You'd also have to have a bit of historical knowledge. You'd have to understand the socio-political issues in Germany at this time, or at specifically 2011, 2012, the refugee crisis and so forth. But that is also a choice. That 6th film called Look Who's Back. Right, so let's just talk about some of these 5 films. Remember, number 5 is the one that I recommend for you, but we should talk about the others. The one thing that you'll notice as we go through them is that they are all very, very different. The first 2, for example, are kind of big Hollywood films. And number 3, and specifically number 4, is kind of indie indie cinema coming out of countries outside of the American context. So there's a lot of different people using these Italian neo-realist techniques, right? From big Hollywood filmmakers all the way through to independent video producers. So it really has had, Italian neorealism has really had a big impact across filmmaking. So Up in the Air, that's the first one. It's a big one. As I said, it's a big Hollywood film. It features George Clooney as the main character. And the first thing you'll notice about that main character is that he is a drifter, right? He's somebody that travels from company to company, and he works for a company that retrenches people. And the most interesting thing about this is that really this exposes the ugly side of the American dream, right? It's a focus on those ordinary people who have lost their jobs. And I think it was partly in response to the financial crisis of 2008. The most interesting aspect of this film is that for the scenes in which people were fired, very often non-professional actors were used. And there were people that had, in previous months, actually been retrenched, right? And the director then asked them to relive that experience and respond as they had wanted to initially when they were fired in real life. So you can see a big theme comes up here, this idea of the blurring between reality and fiction. And here's another important kind of subtopic that comes into it, and that's the topic of existentialism. Right, it's something we haven't really touched on or spoken about yet. I'm sure that you are learning about it in contemporary culture, the idea of existentialism, right? An existential crisis, and that simply means a crisis in meaning, right? Somebody is going through a crisis in meaning. And that very often occurs in Italian neorealism, right? The main character or the cast of main characters, they don't really know their purpose. As we said, it's all about drifting. They don't really move from A to B. They kind of just drift in this empty wasteland that is their life. Okay? And existentialism has a long philosophical history to it. You can speak about the Christian existentialists, philosophers like Kierkegaard. You could talk about Jean-Paul Sartre, right? If we're talking about more contemporary existential philosophers, or of course Albert Camus. And Albert Camus, by the way, is particularly interesting today. He's witnessing a resurgence because he wrote that wonderful book, which is very relevant for today, The Plague. Right, so check that out just as a side note if you're interested. The Plague by Albert Camus. Next up, Bernie. This is classified as a black comedy, right? So very kind of dark, twisted comedy. And again, documentary and fictional elements are going to be blurred. Again, it's got a big star that leads the lineup. It's Jack Black that leads the lineup. But a lot of the people featured in the film are the actual townspeople where this event occurred that the film is based on. Right, so again, it's that idea of blurring. What is real, what is not real, what is fictional, what is documentary. Right, number 3 is a difficult one, and it's a very politicized one, but we should remember at this point that Italian neorealism was a very politicized form of filmmaking, and you'll see in the next lecture, in lecture 10, that especially when Italian neorealism was exported to South America and Africa, it then became deeply politicized. Right? So this film follows in that tradition, and it is kind of a piece on South America. It explores a period in history, and that period is when Che Guevara, the revolutionary, before he became the revolutionary, was a doctor, or finally a medical student, should I say, traveling with his best friend through South America. And they encounter all sorts of atrocious things and people living in depredation and poverty and even horrific things like leprosy. But the scary thing about it is that, again, these are real people featured, and the film is shot in like 2004 or something like that. So you have to ask yourself, my goodness, is this a film about the past? Is this a film about the present? What is this film precisely about? Again, reality is blurred. And let me just say as a side note that, you know, this is a politically biased film. I, for example, am no fan of somebody like Che Guevara, and it does paint him in quite a romantic light. But again, Italian neorealism was a politicized form of filmmaking, especially when it extended to third wave cinema. So especially when it extends to South America and Africa. Then we get to where do we go now? It's by a Lebanese filmmaker. This is also a very explicitly neorealist film, and its idea is to offer a non-Western perspective on a much maligned grouping of people, or those living in the Middle East. So it's trying to show these people in an ordinary light, and this should be familiar to you by now. These people are called ordinary people. Remember, that's the focus. Ordinary people, and they are caught up in an impossible socio-political situation. And they try to kind of negotiate that as best they can, and often they don't succeed. Right, and this is the number 5. This is the big one. This is the one I would like you to focus on, particularly if you're struggling, because it's very, very explicitly linked to Italian neorealism, and that's Rabbit Proof Fence. And it chronicles the struggle of Australia's Aborigine community. It explicitly uses non-professional actors. The main character, Molly, and her 2 sisters are non-professional actors. And again, the focus is on the experience of children. And we know children play a big part in Italian neorealism. Okay, so start thinking about those 5 films. Start looking into them if you can. And the one to pick is number 5, right? And don't forget that 6th film as well, the name of which I've forgotten. That 6th film, Look Who's Back. Look Who's Back, right? That's also an option on the table, but quite a difficult one. Okay, we move on. Okay, so we move on. We said we've talked about the contemporary films. Before we move on to Deleuze and his idea, we just do a bit of a recap in case anybody's a bit lost or confused. Remember, in previous lectures, we read Sergio Pacifici's article, and then we did Sedley and Katina Jones's article, which is just a very short summary. But it's important. Yeah, if you look at Pacifici's article, this is going to kind of really capture Italian neorealism very neatly for you. First part, remember this. This is the most important. Pacifici makes a big distinction between Italian art and society in general, Italian cinema in general, and number 3, Italian neorealism. Right? Which is just a short little film movement that moves from the 40s and it's on its way out in the 50s. And remember, Italian neorealism is responding to the first 2. It's responding to both Italian art and to Italian cinema, both of which it sees as sick, right? It sees them as sick or as ill or as not reflecting Italy properly. And we'll get into more details on the next slide. So, Italian art or Italian society is seen as negative in general. Why? It tended to focus on the past glories of Italy, the Roman Empire, etc. Remember, for them, Italy was this kind of great country with this great history. There was nothing negative there. Italian art and Italian society in general constantly glorified the past and didn't look at the present. Then Italian cinema comes onto the scene. It's a new technology in the country, and it could have done something different with that technology. It could have done something very positive with that technology, but it didn't see its potential, and so it's also seen as negative because instead of doing something different, it just replicated the exact same problematic dynamics as Italian art and society in general, except worse. So, Italian cinema in general picked up on this orientation and produced films that glorified past achievements as well. And I told you guys it became worse, and it did become worse because in the 20s and 30s Mussolini and the fascists came to power, and now it wasn't just the past that was glorified, but the present was also glorified, right? For Mussolini, Italy as it was perfect. Nobody was struggling, nobody was having a tough time. He had made Italy perfect. So film could not deal with real issues affecting ordinary Italians. And that's really summed up in that phrase, Mussolini is always right. And indeed he was, right? And if you said he was wrong, you wouldn't be around for long. Right, so Italian neorealism then is a response to that, and it's seen as positive. So here we're talking about that Italian neorealist response that is seen as positive. Let's take a look. After Mussolini and his fascists had been defeated and overthrown, Italian neorealism emerged. And the filmmakers here, and here's the big names, Rossellini, Visconti, De Sisa, Zavattini, wanted to focus on the real issues faced by ordinary Italians. And you want to kind of double underline that because you have to remember, as we said about Italian art and Italian cinema in general, nobody, believe it or not, nobody had done that before. Nobody had ever focused on the real issues faced by ordinary Italians. It was of no interest to those, to Italian art and to Italian cinema. So in other words, they turned away from an outward perspective or the glorification of Italy and turned inwards, examining the self and the complexities faced by ordinary individuals in very difficult circumstances. And you have to remember that there's kind of a philosophical underpinning to this, and that is that there was a belief that Italy had lost its moral compass. It had found itself on the wrong side of history, and part of the reason that it had lost its moral way was because of that cultural orientation, right? Because of the Italian art and society and cinema in general that just encouraged this mindless glorification. There was no reflexivity, and because there was no reflexivity, these guys had found themselves on the wrong side of history, right? So what the neorealists always aimed for was the opposite of that. It was looking at ordinary people and trying to do that with empathy, solidarity, compassion, and complexity. So we've spoken about this before. So Italian neorealism essentially then becomes what is known as the golden age of Italian cinema, and it's got a few features attached to it that almost always come up. It's stories that are set amongst the poor and the working classes. It's filmed on location and frequently uses non-professional actors. They mostly contend with the difficult economic and moral conditions of Italian post-World War II, of Italy post-World War II, representing changes in the Italian psyche and conditions of everyday life, including poverty, oppression, injustice, and desperation. So, as we said, it's a look on the ugly side of Italy. And as we said, this was the first time that this had happened, that somebody had shone a light on the ugly side of Italy. So here, this is pretty much a recap of the previous slide. Just take a look, slide down to the bottom. We've mentioned this and it's worth mentioning it again. Neorealist films often feature children in major roles. And I asked you guys in previous lectures to consider that. What is the symbolism of children? What do children represent? And the first answer we often get, or when I ask this question in class in normal circumstances, is of course innocence. And that's a good point, right? But these filmmakers aren't trying to proclaim innocence. What they are more interested in is the idea of renewal, right? Not innocence, but renewal. So for them, children symbolize the next generation, the future, the possibility for something different, the possibility for renewal. So one of the big films here, and we'll talk about it a lot more, the reason I bring it up, Roberto Rossellini's Open Cities, because Deleuze is specifically interested in this film, but it established several of the principles of neorealism, depicting clearly the struggle of normal Italian people to live from day to day under the extraordinary difficulties of the German occupation of Rome, consciously doing what they can to resist the occupation. And take a look at this. The children play a key role in this, and their presence at the end of the film is indicative of their role in neorealism as a whole, as observers of the difficulties of today who hold the key to the future. We'll talk about this a lot more, but look at Rossellini's quote. He says, when he was making the film, the situation of the moment, guided by my own and the actors' moods and perspectives, dictated what they shot, and he relied more on improvisation than on a script, right? So I'm going to leave it there for now, but we're going to talk about that a lot more, that idea of mood and perspective and intuition. Remember, they're trying to do a more honest type of filmmaking. So it's not clean, neat, and super tightly scripted like you would see in a, for example, typical Hollywood film. We've already spoken about Vittorio De Sisa's 1948 film, The Bicycle Thief, but it very much covers the same ground as all Italian neorealism, looking at the hardships of working class life after the war, or looking at the lives, in other words, of ordinary people. Okay, so we finally get to Deleuze, and what I'm using this guy for, this particular thinker, is to just complexify further Italian neorealism for you. I think before we get into it, I should just introduce the thinker himself. He's part of what is called the French group of thinkers that emerged in the 60s, called the post-structuralists, and their idea is always to try to break kind of rigid structures or any kind of habitual modes of thinking that we participate in, right? So that's what these guys are against. They're against habit, dogma, and so forth. And for Deleuze, so all their philosophy is really based around that. And there's a lot of big names that operate under the moniker post-structuralism. Foucault is probably the biggest, but Deleuze is very popular now and is very, very big, and is probably, along with Derrida, one of the most complex thinkers in that particular school of thought. But what is Deleuze, what does he see in Italian neorealism? Right? What does he see in it? Remember, he's always on the lookout for something that is unique, something that is different, something that breaks established modes of thinking and habitual modes of thought. And so, when Deleuze looks at Italian neorealism, he sees the birth of a new kind of image outside of Hollywood. And it's important to note, he doesn't just see it in Italian neorealism, he sees it in a whole bunch of film movements, actually, right? He sees it in a whole bunch of film movements. For example, film noir, the film movement we're doing next, coming out of America, he sees it there too. He says something different is happening here. For the first time, cinema is doing something different. It's not just the repetition of old tropes and old filmic systems and so forth. Something different is happening. So let's read a bit. Born out of the ashes of the Second World War, the film movement that became known as Italian neorealism entailed an attempt to break from the cultural heritage of fascism, which had plagued Italy as a consequence of Mussolini's regime. The movement, with its focus on authenticity, as opposed to cliché representations of good, clean living, characteristic of the propaganda films invested in by the aforementioned dictatorship, is best characterized by the works of Rossellini, De Sisa, and Fellini, right, and a few others. So again, what you want to focus on there is authenticity. And what you also want to focus on is the idea of cliché. What is cliché? Cliché is something that is meaningless and repetitive, right? And that's what Deleuze is always looking for, something that operates outside, truly operates outside of cliché. And he's going to find that in Italian neorealism. Okay, so Deleuze begins his discussion of Italian neorealism by pointing out that in relation to the after effects of the war, and unlike France or Germany, for example, Italy could not claim the rank of victor, nor could it be completely dismissed as an uncritical fascist collaborator due to a resistance and a popular life underlying oppression. As such, it was caught in a in-between space. And you want to absolutely focus on that idea of an in-between space. So the Italians, their experience of the war, and therefore their filmmaking after it, was that they were both the bad guys and the good guys at exactly the same time. And that kind of, for Deleuze, he says, because they were the good and the bad guys at precisely the same time, it gave them this kind of intuitive consciousness of something new, something different. You can imagine if you operate in a space like that, if you're both the good guy and the bad guy in the society that you inhabit at precisely the same time, it's going to make you a bit strange, it's going to make you a bit different, it's going to make you think a little bit differently. It's going to be a bit of a liminal experience, right? Indeed, it was the Italian directors, Deleuze claims, who forged the characteristics experimented with in certain types of post-war American cinema, in which would go on to inspire movements such as the French New Wave. And here you want to think back, we talked about that French New Wave all the way back in lecture 2 when we still used to see each other in class physically, right? So go back to those slides as well and see what the French New Wave was up to, right? They were highly, highly experimental. And Deleuze says they take it from these Italians, right? They take it from the Italians, and he says the Italians were always going to be experimental by default because of their experience in the war, being the good guys and the bad guys at precisely the same time, being caught in this weird in-between space. So he's going to provide a number of examples. I'm actually going to jump to the next slide because I've done the same slide, I didn't realize, but just broken up nicely. So here are those examples. The first of which is Rossellini's Rome Open City. And Deleuze says this one, it captures a dispersive and lacunary reality. And Piazza, which presents a series of fragmentary, chopped up encounters. So again, it's not clean, it's not neat, it's dispersive, it isn't kind of coherent, it could be a little bit all over the place, right? Sometimes you don't know if the person that is being shown on screen is dreaming this stuff up or if it's really happening to them. There's this kind of weird hallucinatory element to it, and that's what Deleuze likes about it. It kind of walks that fine line between conscious and unconscious and etc. etc. Similarly, number 2, Deleuze points to the work of De Sica, who in films such as The Bicycle Thief and Umberto D presents no vector or line of the universe which extends and links up events, and shows how even insignificant events have a vital importance for the protagonists. So that's an important one. When we say there's no vector or line of the universe which extends and links up events, we're talking about that idea that in these films there isn't this movement from point A to B like you would see in a typical, for example, Hollywood film. You know, something happens to the main character and they move through a series of events until they get to a resolution. Here there's a lot more drift, there's a lot more insignificant events that play a part. It's much more like real life, right? Think about your lives. It doesn't move in this linear, beautiful path, straight, easy path from A to B. There's a lot of kind of drift and strange flows in your life. And remember that that's what these guys were trying to do. They were trying to be as close to reality as possible. They were trying to be as authentic as possible. And part of that was their representation of time. How do we experience time? How do we experience the events around us? 3, according to Deleuze, Fellini takes this even further in I Vitelloni, in which in his portrayal of 5 young men drifting through life in a small provincial town, It is not only the insignificance of events which is explored, but also it testifies to the uncertainty of the links between them and of their non-belonging to those who experience them in this new form of voyage. Right, so not everything makes sense. Not everything links up. Not everything is kind of like a puzzle that you put together. There's aspects of these men's lives that they never ever figure out. Again, think about that and think about how that relates to our lives versus how the films that we generally watch relate to our lives. So again, there's a lot of drifting. And the drifting isn't just in the story that's told, but how the story is told. And I mentioned to you guys in a previous lecture that the camera also drifts. The camera doesn't direct us from point A to B to C and so forth. It also just drifts, right? Sometimes the camera is pointed at the crowd. It focuses at an individual in that crowd. It focuses on him and her for 2, 3, 4 minutes at a time. Sometimes when the main characters move out of the shot, the camera just stays behind and lingers and looks at the empty space, the space that they vacated. So that idea of drift comes across in many aspects of the film. And it's interesting, it's different, it hadn't been done before. Right, so indeed, the resoluteness on the part of characters employed in the 4 famous Mentor schools of decades past had been replaced by open encounters. That's the big focus. The drift, the open encounter with no set resolution or direction within the any space whatevers that proliferate throughout the films. And this shows a deep commitment to try to contend in an ethical, reflexive manner with the existential vacuum that followed the Second World War. You have to remember the whole of Europe had a massive, well, the whole world had a massive crisis in meaning after the Second World War, right? The question was, how could this continent that is allegedly the height of civilization descend to such barbarism, right? How could it descend to millions and millions dead, groups of people systematically slaughtered? How could it descend to that? How can we live after something like that happens? Okay, so you're going to see now the name at the top, Bogue, and this is still Deleuze. This is just the work of Ronald Bogue, who's kind of one of the top scholars of Deleuze. So he wrote a book called Deleuze on Cinema, and he kind of repackaged his very difficult ideas into something a little bit less difficult, right? So that's why you'll see the name Bogue there at the top. Take a look at what Bogue says. Looks terrifying, but it pretty much is a very fancy way of saying everything we've said up to now. Let's see. Whereas classic cinema is dominated by an organization of space and time according to a rational, common sense, Newtonian, Cartesian sensory motor schema, modern cinema is marked by a breakdown of the sensory motor schema and the creation of images that no longer conform to a single unified spatio-temporal structure. Crucially, these images are not only disconnected from their orthodox common sense chains of association, but are also relinked so that a productive difference emerges between images. Right. You think about that. If it makes no sense to you, fear not. Go back to all the previous slides because we're saying pretty much the same thing. Right. I will leave that one up to you. Let's move on. So Bogue also says the following. He's going to give some examples. This will also make things easier. And this is the last concept we bring up. Take a look at the bottom straight away. We talk about the idea of an up sign and a sun sign, right? An up sign is, of course, optical. So any kind of image that you get in these films, and a sun sign is going to be the sound within these films. So anything that is sound-based. So we're talking about the Italian neorealists' use of image and sound, and this reflects back to what Bogue was saying in the previous slide. So take a look. Bogue and Deleuze in cinema neatly explains the up sign by referencing Rossellini's film Europa 51, in which a high society woman helps the poor in post-war Rome, subsequently going mad in the process of her charity. Bogue writes that she goes through a series of purely optical moments as she, in different scenes, learns to see the realities of poverty and misery. She visits housing projects, observing the grim buildings and surrounding wastelands, and replaces a female factory worker for a day, observing the tumult of workers, as well as the cacophony of machines surrounding her. What is crucial here is that even though these images are eventually assimilated within a coherent narrative, what is demonstrated by Rossellini is that at these crucial moments, the housewife becomes a spectator rather than an active participant. Someone whose seeing is detached from her doing, and what she sees, we also see. So, in other words, she is absolutely overwhelmed by the images she is exposed to. And remember, we as the viewers are following her, so we also get absolutely overwhelmed by these images. There's a similarity here to the Russian and Soviet stuff we did earlier. You get overwhelmed by the imagery. You also get overwhelmed by the sound. So, for example, when she's at the factory, the sounds that she hears both overwhelm her and us. So those are up signs and son signs. Images and sounds that overwhelm the viewer, right? And remember, these Italian guys are relentless in it, right? In a typical American film, for example, say it was about this woman, she would walk into the factory, there would be a minute or two shot of all these sights and sounds of the factories, or it would be put into a sped up montage. But these guys are relentless. They keep the camera rolling on this horrific imagery, or they keep focused on the sound for minutes and minutes and minutes. It becomes a little bit too overwhelming for us. It is these visions which are purely optical situations, disconnected from the common sense coordinates of the standard usages and practices. It is such alienating, and that's what you want to circle, the idea of alienation. It is such alienating, pure optical images that Deleuze calls up signs, and he refers to their sonic counterparts as being son signs. Furthermore, in relation to up signs, and certainly in the films of Fellini, these optical images tend to contain within them a point of indiscernibility, in which it is difficult to distinguish whether the character is experiencing something objective or subjective, real or imaginary, physical or mental. And again, focus on this, the idea of a point of indiscernibility. We said the Italian neorealists were trying to blur the lines, but they weren't just trying to blur the lines of documentary and fiction. They were trying to blur the lines of everything. They were trying to create that in-between space everywhere, right? So when you're watching her experience these things, you don't know, is this real? Is she hallucinating? Is her mind playing tricks on her? Is this really happening, right? They're trying to put you into a very reflective space by doing that, because you are experiencing this along with that character, right? It puts you into this kind of ambivalent or ambiguous space. That's what they're trying to achieve, right? So wonderful stuff. Up signs and sun signs. And that really is the last contribution for now, or for second year level of Deleuze, because this is really stuff that we do in honors in film. Okay, so I'm doing one very quick voice note. We are on minute 43. One quick voice note for the next two slides. This is Rachel Gabara. We won't speak about her article too much. This is going to be covered in lecture 10, but we really are talking about here about the export of Italian neorealism from Italy to Africa and also to South America, but obviously because our geographical location, we focus on Africa. There's a concept to remember here, and this is going to begin a critique of the Italian neorealists, is that reality is never an innocent term. And remember, the Italian neorealists were always saying that they are showing us reality. Interesting stuff. That's going to come up for debate, right? anyone claiming to represent reality in film is in fact representing a version of reality. And that version is always attached with various ideological inclinations. So we're going to start interrogating these guys a little bit. They may have made very beautiful films, but some of their claims may be dubious. We'll see. Right, so this slide, as I said, we've done 45 minutes. It's been pretty hectic. Let's leave this for lecture 10. We'll get into all of this, the export and the questions around Italian neorealism in lecture 10, which will be our last theoretical lecture before lecture 11. We close it up and we do the assignment workshop for essay number 2. And after that, we move on to our third and final film movement. Thank you.